As we read our Bibles, our first task is to discover the original meaning. In some way, we are all theologians. We all interpret our Bibles when we read them. But what principles do we use to do this, and is it helping us arrive at the original meaning? What kind of questions do we need to ask of any text we read? In this episode, we want to look at some of the key principles that will help us read and understand our Bibles.
Welcome to our Leadership Matters Series, The Written Word. In this series, we are going to discuss some of the principles that are helpful in better understanding and applying the truth of the Bible in our lives. Just click the link in the description box to download our free resources or the complete workbook. You can also access any of our other podcasts by going to icmcanada.org/leadershipmatters.
As we've seen in previous episodes, we don't have the freedom to just make the Bible say whatever we want it to, or have a preconceived notion of what we want to believe, and then look throughout the Scripture to find proof texts that confirm our previously held beliefs. Instead, we need to approach the text with humility, reading it carefully and asking the right questions. Now, the fancy word for this is exegesis. One way or another, we all do this already, even if we're not aware that that is what we're doing. What is an effective approach so that we don't just come up with weird and wonderful new theologies or make applications that are more harmful than helpful? Fee and Stewart point out, and as well as others, there are basically two kinds of questions we need to ask. There are questions of context and questions of content. Let's look at the first one of these, the questions of context. See, contextual questions can be divided into historical and literary context. The first thing we need to do as we read and study our Bible is to look at the historical context. We need to be curious about the time and the culture of the original author and the readers. Remember, while Scripture may have an extended meaning in many applications, it always begins with one essential meaning. Without this guardrail, we can make the Bible say anything. Ignoring this principle can be a great way to start a cult, but not really a great way to study your Bible. To get to the meaning of the text, then, it's helpful to know the personal background of the authors, such as Amos or Hosea or Paul, and what were the times in which they were writing the book. When it comes to the prophets, were they writing before or after the exile, for example? It is important to be aware of the messianic expectations in Israel at the time of Jesus' birth and his life. As to the setting, it is important to know the differences between the cities of Corinth or Philippi, as this will have a bearing on the first audience as well as what the author was saying to them. As we will see in future episodes, Jesus' parables, for instance, can become rather problematic if we tend towards allegorizing them, as has been done in the past. But in any case, to understand them better, it is helpful to know the customs of Jesus' day. How much was a denarius worth? An hour, a day, or a week's pay? In addition to the time and culture of the first author and readers, it's also necessary to know the occasion or the purpose of the text. Why was this being written? Was it addressing certain issues or laying out a well-reasoned argument? What caused the author to write the book? For some books, like Proverbs, this is less important than other books like Corinthians, which are letters to specific people and churches which were dealing with specific issues. These are all issues of historical context. It is also important to ask questions of literary context or of the passage. This refers to looking at the words, the sentences, the paragraphs, and what they mean. See, the meaning of words is dependent upon the sentences and paragraphs that contain them, their context. We need to ask, what is the point? Though this will vary from one type of biblical literature to another, it is always a central question. The goal is to discover what the original author intended. This is somewhat problematic as most translations print each verse as a paragraph and even chapters have been divided across paragraphs and thoughts. Our task is to think in terms of paragraphs and units of thought in their context, rather than just chapters and verses as most of our Bibles are organized. Okay, so finally we come to the questions of content. The meaning of words is important for any effective communication to take place. This can be confusing in some translations, as we see in the King James of 2 Corinthians 5:16. The word flesh, as in we know no man after the flesh, is used. What does that mean in normal English? The NIV comes closer to the meaning by translating this passage, we do not regard no one from a worldly point of view. So Paul is not talking about knowing Christ in his earthly life or flesh, but what we are to no longer perceive him from a worldly point of view. See, to arrive at the basic understanding of either the historical or the grammatical context, the good news is we don't have to figure it all out on our own. There are many good tools to assist us in this process. While the Bible contains the answers to many of these questions within the text, other tools like Bible dictionaries and encyclopedias and handbooks can be helpful. Of course, most of these and many more are available online these days. There are also books on the history of the Bible times, as well as books on Bible introduction and introductory material and commentaries that can be helpful in this regard. We'll discuss resources at more length in a later episode. What have you learned about the need to look at questions of context and content when reading a passage?
For this series, we are providing some free resources, which include a Bible study worksheet, 2 different Bible reading plans, as well as a chart describing the various genre of Scripture. To download these, click the links in the description box below. You can also view any of Phil's other podcast series at icmcanada.org/leadershipmatters. These include Mentoring Intelligence, Finishing the Race, Multicultural Teams, and the Fivefold Ministry. If you are interested in a more comprehensive leadership training program, check out our Christian Leadership Institute at mcnetcli.org. This is a unique online competency-based ministerial training based on a mentoring relationship. For other leadership resources, please visit our library at icmcanada.org/resources.
Before the break, we saw that looking at questions of context and content can help us arrive at the meaning of the passage. What are some of the specific questions we can ask of the text to help us discover its meaning? Many times this information is in the passage or other scripture, and other times Bible resources are helpful instead. It is as basic as researching the general historical context. Like, who is the author and what do we know about him? Who are the readers and what do we know about them? What is the relationship between the readers and the author? And perhaps most important, what was the purpose of the writing? Next, it is helpful to research the historical background. What is the setting of the passage and what events led up to the point of the passage? Were there trends at the time that affected the writer, and how did they affect the passage itself? Like, what was really going on here? It is also helpful to consider if there are other biblical passages in the same historical setting and what ways they shed light on this passage. Is this passage bringing an end to some events or concepts, or does it seem to be a continuance or of previous ideas? Now, a third set of questions relate to the social setting. Considering where the events of the passage fit into the overall society at the time can be very insightful. Are there social or civic or civil institutions that have a bearing on the passage? Is the passage directly relevant only to ancient culture? Is it culturally bound? Or is it still useful and meaningful today? See, at this point, it may be helpful to make a few comments regarding the principle of continuity and discontinuity. See, every truth in Scripture is composed of both a principle and a practice or application. Now, the principle of a truth is timeless and has practical significance for every age and every culture. However, in some cases, the practice or application of a scriptural truth may be culturally bound. If a truth is culturally bound in the biblical world, it does not mean that the greater principle or truth is culturally bound. So the reader's task is to discern the true principle presented in Scripture and clearly understand how it can be practiced or applied in the contemporary world in which we live. It's not so much of whether a text is continuous or discontinuous, but rather what is continuous about the text and what elements may be discontinuous. Now, the fourth set of questions have to do with the historical foreground. This means considering what events immediately follow the passage. What happens to the people, the places, and the concepts of the passage? Does the passage contain information that is essential to the understanding something that occurs or is said later? Where does the passage fit in the general scope of biblical history? Perhaps not so obvious is the benefit that can be had from researching the geographic setting. For example, what nation or region, territory or village do the events or concepts of the passage apply? Does the passage have a regional or national perspective? Do issues such as climate, topography, and economy play a role in the passage and application? See, it's helpful to consider if any other geographic factors shed light on the content of the passage in some way. And finally, it's also important to date the passage to determine what period of time the event of the passage cover. When was it written? If it is prophetic, when was the prophecy given, and has it been fulfilled or is it yet to be fulfilled? Having considered these 6 groups of historical questions for a passage, it is important to write a summary of the information. What did you find most interesting? Did anything surprise you? What do you discover about the truths that were communicated to the original audience, and how did these truths practically apply to them? These are all issues related to the historical context of a passage. So next we need to look at the literary context. Choose a passage of Scripture and apply these questions, writing a summary of what you have learned. Understanding the literary context means that we pay particular attention to the meaning of language and the flow of thought. We will look at this in more detail in future episodes, but for now we just need to be aware that we are looking for grammatical features such as repetition of words, contrast, comparison, lists, cause and effect, figures of speech. I'm not suggesting that we have to be grammatical experts. I ain't one of them. Guess that proves it. But we should at least be able to identify if the verb is active or passive. For example, Colossians 3:1, you have been raised with Christ, is passive, while the next part of the verse, set your hearts on things above, is active. It's important to also accurately identify pronoun references. Who is speaking to who? We can look for questions and answers, purpose statements, conditional clauses, commands, and the emotional tone. The obvious task of the reader is to observe what immediately precedes the passage and what follows it. This will help trace the flow of thought of the author and helps to identify the author's overall intent. This means identifying words and phrases that we may need to investigate further. And remember, the context of a word, the phrase, sentence, paragraph, and so on, determines the meaning and use of the word. See, while words usually have a range of meaning, they can usually only have one meaning at a time. As we wrap up this introductory episode on the initial questions of context and content that we need to ask of the text in order to understand the historical and grammatical context, let me provide a few more textual issues to help us get to the intended meaning of the passage. First, it is important to make implicit information explicit. In other words, what seems to be the assumptions the author is making that are embedded in the original cultural context. Though not as common in English, it is also important to realize that literary doublets, repetitions, are usually synonymous and are used for emphasis. They do not signify 2 different meanings. This is common and used over 600 times in the New Testament alone. We also need to identify which questions in the text are rhetorical, such as 1 Corinthians 1:13 and 2 Corinthians 1:17, and which are real questions, such as Matthew 22:42 and Acts 7:8. Who is the passage referring to is important, as are the metaphors, which are used over 1,000 times in the New Testament. It's important to clarify between the metaphor and the actual meaning. In a previous episode, we discussed how allegorical interpretations was prevalent during certain times of church history. See, the inspired writers were and can be allegorical, evidenced by many passages in Hebrews, which shed light on Old Testament thoughts through allegorical language. But we today don't have the freedom to invent new truths through allegorical interpretation. This becomes too subjective and puts the interpreter in the position of the authority rather than Scripture being authoritative. Choose a passage and apply these principles of literary context. How has this helped you better understand the meaning of the text? So before we discuss how we arrive at the contemporary meaning of the passage, the fancy word for that being hermeneutics, I would like to spend one more episode discussing how we arrive at the original meaning of the passage, referred to as exegesis. I understand that it's easy to get into the weeds in this subject as there's lots to discuss. But I'm trying to clarify, not confuse in this series. So, and of course, this means I have to summarize and kind of simplify what can be a rather complex topic. And if you'd like more detail, of course, you can read some of the books that I've mentioned by Fee or Stewart and McQuilkin, and of course, there's many other authors on the topic. But the goal here is to provide some straightforward tools that can help us read our Bible with more understanding so that the Spirit can draw relevant application in our contemporary lives. I hope you join me next time as we continue on that journey.
Thank you for listening to Leadership Matters and subscribing and sharing us. If you would like any of the resources or your own copy of this study, just click on the link in the description box. For any of our other leadership resources, check out our website, icmcanada.org/resources.